I can't be the only one to see this resemblance. Cimoooooooo! What's going on, guys? It's Cimo. So today I wanted to bring to you a card discussion about a brand new card that just got announced for Extreme Force, the set following Circuit Break, and that card is Mikuratori. Now, this card is rather interesting because it takes advantage of the column mechanic in a very interesting way, and that's why I wanted to discuss it with you. So, for those of you who haven't seen this card already, Mikuratori is a level 4 Dark Winged Beast type monster with 1300 attack and 1500 defense, and the effect reads, this card gains the following effects depending on the main monster zone in which it's placed in. Leftmost, this card gains 1000 attack and defense. Rightmost, this card can attack up to 2 monsters during each battle phase. Middle, this card cannot be targeted or destroyed by your opponent's card effects. Otherwise, monsters in the same column as this card cannot activate their effects. So that's a mouthful, and we're going to discuss each of these in depth and why these applications could be useful. But the first thing I wanted to discuss is that what came to mind when I first read about this card is the fact that it's very similar to the Adapt mechanic from Hearthstone. Now, for those of you who don't know what the fuck I'm talking about, Adapt is a mechanic that when you play a minion on the board, it gets to choose from one of 3 different abilities out of a pool of 9 in total. So you play the minion, 3 abilities pop up, and you get to give your minion different abilities and bestow them with certain privileges. So for example, you might give it more attack or more health, or might make it immune to being targeted by certain effects, or different things like that. This seems very reminiscent of that to me, but there's one key difference. The problem with the Adapt mechanic in Hearthstone is the fact that it's a randomized pool of effects. So you don't really know what you're going to get, and you're not going to have a consistent effect that you're going to get every single time. Maybe you need a certain effect in a certain pinch, and maybe you don't get it, and then you're just shit out of luck. Where with Mikuratori, this card has all the effects laid out that you can have, so you know what you have the possibility to get, and there's no randomization. But there's one difference though, is that the placement of the card actually matters, and compared to a game like Hearthstone, where you place your minions and you can place them in between others or on the outside, doesn't really matter, the game kind of shifts as you place your minions on the board. Yu-Gi-Oh! You're fixed into your specific monster positioning, so if you have a monster in the zone you wish to play Mikuratori, and you have no way of removing it, or no way of like exceeding or doing anything like that to get the full effect that you want to use the card that it's intended for, then you're just going to be shit out of luck in that respect as well. But it was very familiar to me, so I kind of wanted to discuss that I like that this is a mechanic that Yu-Gi-Oh! Is attempting to implement into our game, and I think that's really cool. So let's talk about each one of these individual effects because I think they're worth discussing. So the first one, leftmost, gain 1000 attack and defense. That means we now have a level 4 2300 attack, 2500 defense monster. That seems a little bit crazy, but if I told you we had a level 4 2300 attack, 2500 defense vanilla, would you really play it in your deck? Well, we have Rescue Rabbit, so maybe, but I don't know. It's kind of something that seems really cool in theory, but when you really think about the application for a card like that, how often would you need something like that to pretty much utilize in any board state whatsoever? I guess it can out a Naturia Beast as a normal summonable monster, which can be relevant since Naturia Beast can be completely oppressive, but I don't really know how often that's going to come up, or if the meta shapes up in such a way that Naturia Beast is going to be that prevalent. Then you have the rightmost effect, which this card can attack up to 2 monsters during each battle phase. Now, when I first read this, I thought it could just declare 2 attacks in general, which would be much better because then you could punch your opponent for 2600 direct in the face if your opponent doesn't have any monsters, or you could like punch an attack into a monster and then hit him for 1300 direct. I think that would give this a lot more flexibility, even though this card already has drastic amounts of flexibility as it is. I think if it was worded just a lot more simply like that, it would be even better. But again, this is kind of a thing that's good if your opponent has a deck full of very weak monsters and you just want to punch through a couple of them. Maybe you're trying to kill a couple of scapegoats, or hell, I guess the Zodiac monsters are really weak, so maybe you could punch through a couple of them. It really is dependent on how a format shapes up for how useful that effect's going to be. Then we have the middle column effect, which reads, this card cannot be targeted or destroyed by your opponent's card effects. Now this is really cool because say for instance you are playing against Zodiac and your opponent has a Trident on the board, you can summon this in the middle column. They can't destroy it with Trident, and the only way they can destroy it is to take a minus and equip a Whiptail underneath it. But this thing is going to hit over that Trident, and that seems really cool to me that we have a card that's kind of normal summonable that has an effect like that, so that can be pretty useful. But I think an effect like this is better well reserved for a monster that has a much larger body. Like, you need something that has like 2800 attack or 3000 or 3200 attack that can't be targeted or destroyed by card effects to really make your opponent start sweating, because yeah, we have kaijus and stuff like that as well. But I guess it's kind of funny because is your opponent really going to kaiju a 1300 attack monster? Probably not, so it kind of, I guess, plays this interesting dynamic that it's something that can be annoying to deal with, but they're probably not going to kaiju it because it's so little that it really doesn't make that big of an impact on the board that it's worth wasting a kaiju on. And then the last effect, and arguably the best effect that this monster has, is that monsters in the same column as this card cannot activate their effects. Now, this is for the second and the fourth column, which just so happen to be the columns that have the extra monster zone. So that can be a really big deal, because not only if you have this monster on the board can your opponent not use the effects of monsters that are in those columns, which isn't that great because for the main monster zone your opponent can just play around it, so it doesn't really matter too much. But because the extra monster zone is restricted and locked and fixed in place, they can't play around that. So they can't play an extra monster zone out of their, or excuse me, a monster out of their extra deck in the extra monster zone, so they're not going to be able to get any of the effects of those monsters because of the way the game board is actually designed. And that was one of my big issues with column-based cards in general, is the fact that the extra monster zone is especially vulnerable, and Mikuratori is a prime example of something that I don't exactly like that you're hindered to because of game mechanics. But I do like it because if your opponent does have monsters in the extra monster zone, because it is a passive effect like Denko Sekka, the second you place it down, they can't like chain or anything in response to it. I think that's pretty neat, and that's actually something that can be very useful depending on the monster that they have in the extra monster zone. Some other synergies that do come up with this card, it is dark attribute, meaning it's got synergy with Allure of Darkness. You can search it off of Raid Raptor Force Strix, which is a generic rank 4, so I mean if you really need to access this card, there you go. And also you can burn it for an Icarus attack to pop 2 of your opponent's cards. So let's say like in the best case scenario, you could hit 2 of their monsters with the double attack, then Icarus attack and pop 2 of their back row. Like, that's some pretty good value there, but that's honestly very optimistic thinking in that respect. What I don't like about this card, and this is the downside of it, I don't feel like a card like this is good enough to see play. Don't get me wrong, this card is very good if you look at it in a vacuum. It's got 4 very decent effects, but it's not like broken good. It's just like okay and like decent. And like in a world of generic monsters, this card is pretty decent. But I think the fact that maybe it's not so the fact that the effects aren't powerful enough, but it's more so the fact that there's nothing to search this. Like, yeah, you can search it with Force Strix, and I'm sure you could search it with a couple other cards as well, but there's nothing, like, generic that you can search this with. Like, if there was a Reinforcement of the Army or a Tenki that could search this card, now we're fucking talking, because now we can toolbox into it, and now we have access to 4 extremely powerful effects with ease. But because you're kind of hoping to rely on drawing this card in your opening hand, or you're, like, hoping to top deck it or some shit like that, that doesn't really do any good. If we get more support for a card like this, or maybe there's going to be a whole series of these cards, or maybe there's going to be a searcher for this card later on in the future once we get more cards revealed out of the set, then this card might see a lot of play. But ultimately, I don't think it's going to, because it just doesn't make the cut, even though this card does have a lot of really cool effects. I do want to end this video, though, on a very positive note, and the reason for that is because I like how Konami is taking advantage of the column mechanic in this respect, and I want to give them credit for that, because one of the big complaints I had about the column mechanic was seemingly the reliance on your opponent's placement of their cards to make sure that your cards with column mechanics and effects that rely on the columns get their full value. But a card like Mikuratori, you can get the full benefit of it purely on your own merit and how you utilize the card and how you want to best take advantage of the effects that the card has to offer, and it doesn't require any interaction with your opponent to get the value out of that. I'd love to see more cards like this, and I really hope Konami takes note of that. If we get like 10 or 20 different cards that have like 4 different effects depending on the column that we're in, that would be really fucking cool. And just imagine for a moment what it would be like if you had an insanely fucking broken version of a card like this that, just depending on whatever column you in, it just had 4 insanely broken effects. Like, if it's in the middle column, like, you Harpy's Feather Duster your opponent's field, or if it's in the leftmost column, you get to, like, draw 2 cards. Like, I know I'm talking, like, something that's never going to happen, but there is a lot of potential here, and that's what really excites me about this card more than anything. It's not going to see any play on the competitive level. Maybe at the very least, you might barely see it, but I doubt it's going to have any effect at all. But I'm more so excited the potential that these column mechanic based cards might have looking into the future. But guys, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down in the comments what you guys think about Mikuratori. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. It's a really cool card, and I definitely think it's something that we should be getting excited about. So guys, thank you so much for watching the video. Be sure to like the video as always. Subscribe to the channel for more amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. And if you found this video informative, consider backing me on Patreon, because just by pledging only $1 a month, you're investing in my ability to continue bringing you amazing Yu-Gi-Oh content. So thanks so much again, and we'll see you next time.